All right. So on Friday, before we left, we went over the Declaration of Sentiments, and I asked you guys these different questions about the different things that were these grievances or complaints that the women of the Seneca Falls Conference drafted during the Declaration of Sentiments. Basically, if you were surprised by any of them, do any of them kind of hold true today? We had a really good discussion on basically just what was happening, okay? So the next couple of slides you don't necessarily have to write down. I just want to review with you really quick. Excuse me. So the Declaration of Sentiments was written at Seneca Falls in 1849. So, before the Civil War, very, very long time ago from where we're at right now. Okay. But that just gives us some basis as to the fact that the women's suffrage movement or the women's suffrage fight had been going on for a very, very long time. Okay. Just a little bit of a refresher. So we had that document, and it's from 1849, before the Civil War, before the end of the Civil War. And what comes at the end of the Civil War, is the 15th Amendment, which was in 1871, okay? We've talked about the 15th Amendment before in U.S. History A, but just as a refresher for you, the 15th Amendment granted African-American men the right to vote, okay? So even though we have the Declaration of Sentiments, even though we have this long history of women's suffrage and women gaining the right to vote, African-American men are granted the vote before, okay? Basically immediately after the Civil War, or within the following years of the Civil War, we decided that that's the next amendment we wanted to do, okay? The passage of the 15th Amendment disappointed a lot of people who thought women and African-American men should be enfranchised or given the right to vote at the same time, given that, African-Americans, or the thought process basically was that African-Americans and women were both unable to vote for the same amount of time. Both of them should be given the right to vote at the same time, okay? African Americans were split over whether men should get the vote before women. So even people of color or the minority group African Americans, even though this was a huge feat or a really good thing for African Americans, they were very torn over whether this was actually a good thing or if they should, or if this is just more divisive, that men were going to get the vote before women, okay? So I have two quotes I'd like to show you, both from African Americans, very prominent African Americans during this time, basically post-Civil War, okay? And their thoughts on what was happening with the 15th Amendment and how it kind of ties into the women's suffrage movement, okay? So the first quote I would like to show you, or the first quote I'd like to share with you, is from Frederick Douglass. And he was quoted this in 1869, so basically before the 15th Amendment was passed. He is quoted as saying, when women, because they are women, are dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed upon the pavement, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. There's a question asked, said that, but was this not true for Black women? Frederick Douglass says, yes, it is true for Black women, but not because she is woman, but because she is Black. So Frederick Douglass, probably the most prominent, African-American figures during this time period, is basically saying, women will have their time, but right now it needs to be for African Americans because we are suffering these things because we are Black, not because we are women, because we are Black. African American women are experiencing the same thing, but it's because they are Black, not because they are women, okay? At the same time, or on the same subject, basically, we have a woman's perspective, an African American woman's perspective, with this lady, or with the prominent figure Sojourner Truth, okay? In the same year, the same prominence as Frederick Douglass, just from a woman's perspective, Sojourner Truth said, there is a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word of colored women. And if colored men get their rights and not colored women theirs, you see the colored men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before. So again, another perspective that Sojourner Truth is saying, yeah, men or African Americans need the right to vote as well. But if we don't do these things at the same time, or if we don't afford African American women the same rights as African American men, then we're going to just have another master slave situation, and it's just going to be like it was before. Now instead of white masters being over African American slaves, it would be men over women, and that would be the tone that we're setting, okay? So two very different opinions on the same subject from two very prominent African American figures that kind of show the difference and how these people were struggling of basically, what do we do? What seems to be the right solution here, okay? Do we give them to them at the same time, or do we just focus on one hurdle before we focus on the next, okay? Obviously, since we know from U.S. History A, we know that they chose one hurdle at a time. The 15th Amendment is passed, and African American men are awarded the right to vote. Okay, women are still sitting on the back burner, and the fight continues. Okay. As we get towards the beginning of the 19th century, or I should say the 20th century, yes, this is where we can start writing. Yep. The other three, you didn't necessarily have to write. It was a little bit of review and then some quotes, but this is where we need to actually start writing, okay? So as we hit the 20th century and as we hit the early 1900s, we see the emergence of an actual group or of an actual organization for the change in women's suffrage or for women's suffrage called the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA. That one's not as cool sounding. Okay? NASA. Yeah. You did? Nice. There's a lot of cool primary sources from these conventions, like speeches and stuff that you never get to see, especially like African American speeches too. You never get to see them. They're really cool. So the National American Women's Suffrage Association was led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Some people say Cady, some people say Katie. I say Cady. So Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they had been very prominent figures in the suffrage movement for literal decades at this point. And they just basically take it a step further by spearheading this group that was going to allow women from across the country to come together at these different conventions like the one at Seneca Falls, and through their own like organizations on a local level to press for women's suffrage. Okay. The National American Women's Suffrage Association was presented with two like ways that they could do this. Okay, there are two paths basically that they could take that would eventually lead to suffrage for women or enfranchisement of women. Okay, one strategy was to win suffrage state by state. So there were certain states, and that had already had for a very long time, or who were on the train basically, of giving women the right to vote, at least in local elections, and had been for a long time. So one option was to continue on the state by state basis. We gain support, and by the time that we have a majority of the states on the same page, then we can ask for a constitutional amendment, okay? Or, by the time that we get a majority, they can't say no to us, basically, right? Versus the other path is going directly for a constitutional amendment, that we don't need to do the state by state thing. We can achieve ratification by 2/3 majority, or 36 states at this point, and we'll just go straight for the amendment. Yeah. No, so like if I went straight for the constitutional amendment, as long as I can get 36 states to say yes, then we're good to go. I don't have to have, individual suffrage in all of those states. I just need 36 of them to say yes, and then it's a nationwide thing. Versus if I take the state by state thing, I have to go through every single state and get all of them passed, and then eventually they're like, there's a majority, we have to give it to you, basically. Yeah, Aiden.
Is it still 36 states?
No, it's a little bit higher, just ever so slightly, because we added a few states after 1900.
So
you need like 37 now. You need like 37, 38, something like that. It's 2/3 no matter what, so 2/3 of 50. I don't do math. You can do the math in your head. That's what it is right now. But you needed at least 36 to pass the constitutional amendment back then. So this source or this picture really doesn't mean anything other than the fact that this is a convention that happened in 1899 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So really close to kind of where we're at right now, right? I just thought it was cool. This is at the Iowa State Historical Society. I found it on their website. I just thought it was cool. All right, so this is all happening, or this is the time frame of women's suffrage before 1910, okay? That all of these things are happening before 1910, or this kind of progress is all happening before the turn of the century, basically, okay? So I found a new chip the other day, and it was flamin' hot barbecue. And I had some for lunch today, and now it's giving me heartburn. I don't do well with hot stuff anyway. Clearly. Walmart. Walmart? Oh yeah, the Carolina Reaper pepper or whatever. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's like part of getting hired. You have to try all of them. I haven't done the Blazing Challenge. I will never do the Blazing Challenge, but yeah. You guys go ahead. You have to be 18 or you have to have a parent with you to do it. So Blazing Challenge. It's 10 weens in 5 minutes of that new Carolina Reaper sauce. What? If you gave me a ghost pepper to eat and gave me $10,000 to eat it, would I? Yeah.
What about sitting in the bathtub those times?
No.
I'd rather sit in a bathtub full of snakes. I don't burn myself.
Some peppermint? I got gum. Right now. Is that supposed to help with heartburn? Oh, really? I say I got gum right now. I always eat gum after because it normally helps a little bit with heartburn, but I didn't know that. That's interesting. Snakes? No. If you give me one singular like Carolina Reaper pepper to eat, I'll eat it. No, I still don't like it. I don't even like when I gotta pick up a spider and go put it outside or something. I make somebody else do it.
I know what my alarm went.
Did your alarm not go off this morning?
No, my mom.
Oh goodness. Okay. So all of this is happening before 1900 or before 1910. This is basically the beginnings of the suffrage movement. Okay. This is basically where we were sitting as we were trying to do. Basically, they chose a state by state basis. Okay. So they chose to go with if we get enough states to vote yes over a period of time, then we can eventually kind of overcome it and have the majority instead of going straight for a constitutional amendment. Women's suffrage before 1920 looked a little bit something like this. So we have, small states kind of going across basically from the west to the east. Excuse me. The reason that we have more suffrage in the east, or the west, my apologies. The more reason that we have suffrage in the west, I might be having a stroke. The reason that we have more suffrage in the West versus in the East, or the reason we have suffrage before in the West than we do in the East, is because the West had always been more progressive than the East. We have that era of Western expansion, and we've got basically this era of lawlessness happening. If you remember back to U.S. History A, where we've got people just kind of doing whatever they want. There's, not a whole lot going on. And one of those things that can happen, or one of the things that's also happening when it comes to this lawlessness is that they're holding women, especially like single women or widows, to a higher standard out west than they did in the east. They're holding them to the same standard as men, especially as you can see here, Wyoming is the first one that's going to grant it in 1869 before any of the rest of these countries or the rest of these states do, okay? So all of these, in this reddish color, whatever you want to call it, with the date have already been passed before 1920. The orangish color is partial women's suffrage, so like maybe they can vote in local elections, but not state elections. And things in yellow are no women's suffrage whatsoever, okay? We can see that a lot of the yellow is based in the southern coast and kind of going up towards the east coast. This is basically because this is the area that's affected the most by the Civil War, and they're still bouncing back from African Americans voting. They've got Reconstruction to worry about, so they don't really have a whole lot of stuff going on with women's suffrage, okay? All right, so let's talk about Susan B. Anthony for just a second. She is the leader of the National Women's Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association. And she is often called the mother of the suffragist movement. From the very beginning of the suffrage movement, or from the very beginning of her involvement in the suffrage movement, she pushed as hard as she could, wrote so many things, tried to get every convention possible, tried to plead to legislator after legislator after legislator about suffrage. I don't think she ever stopped in her lifetime, okay? She was successful at least 3 times of introducing an amendment bill for women's suffrage to the Senate, but it was always killed by the time that she got there, meaning it was always like denied as far as she got, it was always struck down. Although she is often referred to as the mother of the suffragist movement, and she worked very, very hard as an individual, she was not alone. But I do think she worked the hardest out of all of these prominent women for the suffrage movement to get this passed. We are going to watch a short video on Susan B. Anthony, just a small biography. It's almost even like a snippet of a biography, basically a rundown or a summary of her life as a suffragette. And a kind of interesting story about her that you may not know. Give you guys a couple more seconds to finish this up, and then I'll switch it over. Can't tell what classroom it came from. I think it came from Mr. Bennett's, but I can't tell. All right. So let's watch this really quickly. It's only a couple of minutes, so we'll just watch it about, kind of the life of the suffragette of Susan B. Anthony. And I just need your attention. You don't have to write anything for it. Come on.
Was a great inspirational leader. She rallied hundreds of thousands of women.
Susan B. Anthony changed the course of history for women in the United States.
At the beginning of her career, of her dedication to women's rights, she was much despised.
Her arrest for voting in the 1872 presidential election and eventual trial paved the way for women's political rights.
One of the things she brought to the women's movement was a tremendous faith.
Susan B. Anthony was born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. She was from a tight-knit Quaker family who believed in education.
In the Quaker meeting house, men and women spoke equally. And so Susan B. Anthony was not the best, but it was everywhere.
The reality was most women were uneducated, could not own property, had few legal rights, and were subservient to men. And Susan B. Anthony wanted equal rights under the law for both sexes. Anthony met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the architect of the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, and the duo teamed up.
They were responsible for every right we have as women today. Stan had the intellectual vision, she had the way of word, and Anthony had the beginning of vision of what it meant to build a movement.
It was 1872 that Anthony caused a national sensation when she voted in a presidential election illegally.
On November 1st, 1872, Anthony left her house on 17 Madison Street with her three sisters and walked to the local watershed, where, as usual, eligible men were being registered to vote. She demanded to be registered herself. She insisted that since she was a U.S. citizen, she had the right to vote under the 14th Amendment. Anthony's goal was simple: to force a case before the Supreme Court and decide once and for all if the 14th Amendment should extend to women. Early in the morning of November 5th, Susan B. Anthony and her followers went to the polls to vote. The incident quickly escalated into a national sensation. Anthony and her followers in Rochester were jailed and charged with voting illegally. Released on $1,000 bail, Susan B. Anthony was brought to trial on June 17, 1873, at the village courthouse in Canandaigua, New York.
Her trial was such a travesty of justice that it's really unbelievable when you consider that it was Susan B. Anthony, who was very well known across the country already. They were the former president of the United States in the courtroom, Millard Fillmore, and they were congressmen. But anyway, even though this was a situation that would be very important people in the courtroom, and the eyes of the country in the courtroom, still Susan B. Anthony was not allowed to speak in her own defense.
Judge Hunt boomed out his verdict. The sentence of the court is that you pay a fine of $100 and the costs of prosecution, or serve 10 days in jail. Madam, the court will not order you to stand committed until the fine is paid. The statement was as illogical as it was contradictory. Hunt was threatening Anthony with jail only if she obeyed his ruling. However, there was a well-thought-out plan behind his actions. If he had ordered Anthony to be imprisoned until the fine was paid, she could have immediately appealed his decision to the Supreme Court. Now that option was far more difficult. Although Anthony was free, she had effectively lost any reasonable opportunity to bring a landmark case before the highest court in the land.
The trial was rigged. Her vote didn't count, but she got great publicity value out of it.
Anthony was fined $100, which she never paid. She did, however, continue to spread the word on women's rights throughout the U.S. and Europe.
She appeared in front of every Congress from 1869 until 1906, the year she died.
Women were finally given the right to vote in 1920, 16 years after Susan B. Anthony died.
I think that every February 15th, women in this country should recognize that as Susan B. Anthony's birthday, and just for a second, say thank you.
They do, by the way. Normally February 15th, or at least like if it's an election day, most people will go and put their sticker on Susan B. Anthony's gravestone as kind of like a thank you for the right to vote, basically, okay? So the reason I show you guys that video is because you guys might not have known that Susan B. Anthony went on trial for trying to vote when she wasn't supposed to, basically, and that the fine or the punishment was paying $100, and she never ended up paying it. So she basically died a criminal. But I mean, even if, like they said in the video, even if she would have went to jail, even if she would have paid the fine, she got so much publicity out of it and was able to create a platform for herself. Like they said as well, she went before every single Congress, every single congressional session from 1869 to the day of her death, or to the year of her death in 1906, and really worked so hard for the suffrage movement, okay? All right, so on the other side, we will always have another side, basically, okay? That if on one side is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott and other very prominent suffragists, there's always an opposite side who don't believe in what they believe in, or somebody who is trying to fight against what they are trying to do. So in this corner and the other corner are anti-suffragists. Anti-suffragists are those who oppose extending the right to vote to women. And very surprisingly, a lot of anti-suffragists were women. There was a lot of women who thought, well, why do I need the right to vote? My husband votes on my behalf, or I'm raising these people to vote on my behalf. I don't do as much as everyone else, so why should I be able to vote? Okay. For a majority, though, it was men who were anti-suffragists, but there were a lot of anti-suffragist women as well. Most of the belief system of anti-suffragists were along the lines that, reasons not to vote, basically. I got a list here for you. Reasons that women should not vote, according to anti-suffragists. That women were high-strung, emotional, and irrational, so they could not make a clear decision. Women were not smart or educated enough, which in some cases may be true, but it's only because they weren't allowed to go to school. Women should stay home, that they shouldn't worry themselves with the things outside of the home, therefore voting was irrelevant. This one's my favorite. That women are too physically frail and they would get tired walking to the polling station. You know what? Sometimes just 2 blocks is too much, man. If I had to wear heels and a big dress, I'd probably be tired too. Can't have my dudes.
You want to care how far it is.
Absolutely.
Were there ever men that supported those?
Absolutely. Oh yeah. There's always people, there's people on both genders for both sides, basically. There were men who were suffragists and really wanted women to have the vote. There were men who were anti-suffragists. The last one on the list here is that if women voted, that women would become masculine. That by voting and in concerning themselves with politics and kind of the concerns of the world, they would become masculine by having that knowledge. So again, I talk about the value of hindsight sometimes, or a lot of times in here. So we know the value of hindsight being that all of these are ridiculous agreements. That all of these are ridiculous things to just make things up, basically, of why women aren't capable of voting. But to anti-suffragists during that time period, especially before 1900, these were very real things that people believed in. Okay?
Quick question.
Yeah. Huh?
When were cars showed?
Late night or 19 teens. 19 teens, 1920s. All right. So I have a couple of examples for you. I'll give you a couple more seconds to write down the belief system, but I have a couple of examples for you of political cartoons that anti-suffragists made. So basically political cartoons that are pushing that women should not vote or that women should not have the right to vote. Just because, like I said, we can look in hindsight and realize that these types of statements are kind of ridiculous. And we can also do the same thing for cartoons, that we can look back at them and they kind of laugh at them, okay? All right, so a couple of cartoons I'd like to show you that say that women should not be voting are kind of pro-anti-suffragists, okay? These are some of my favorites. I'll let you soak them in for a second, then we'll talk about them. Okay. I just think they're funny. They are kind of weird, but we think they're weird because they're ridiculous. All right, so let's talk about this one right here. It'd be to your right, okay? So everybody works but mother. She's a suffragette. I want to vote, but my wife won't let me. It kind of sounds like a cartoon today. So basically, if mom's out there or if the woman's out there doing all those things, then what's the man supposed to do? Sit here and clean dishes? Absurd, okay? Absurd, right? The one in the middle here, you know, these people are saying down with man, husbands for old maids, that we should be able to vote. And this one is basically saying, so it says at the suffragette meetings, you can hear some plain things and see them too. Being plain meant being like ugly, like nothing to look at, basically. So they're basically making fun of women's appearance who were suffragettes, because, you know, that's an easy thing to go after. We use those things all the time today too, okay? So they're basically saying, like, look at all these women who are at the voting thing. You don't want to be with them anyway. They're plain, they're ugly, okay? And then my absolute favorite off here to the left, girls are doing all the fellows' jobs now because apparently voting turns you into a lesbian. So these are just a couple of examples of the type of propaganda that anti-suffragists would put out. And in return, suffragettes would just be like, okay, and we're still going to keep working for it, okay? All right, so basically we get to this point where we're at the turn of the century and we have a new generation or the next generation moving into the women's suffragist movement. This is how you know that the women's suffragist movement had been going on for so long, that we get a new generation because the old leaders had passed away. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton ended up dying in 1902 and Susan B. Anthony died in 1906. So the group, especially like Nassau and other suffragist movements, lost their leaders because they had just died of old age. Okay. However, at the same time, during the turn of the 20th century, many young middle-class women still joining or are continuing to join the the suffrage movement. So the suffrage movement before had mostly been like older, middle to high class women. And at the turn of the century, we see a lot of young middle class women and a lot of working class women joining the fight that we had never seen before. Basically, they were diversifying the opinion. Working class women had joined the cause basically in hoping that the right to vote would improve working conditions. Because a lot of the conditions that we talked about, like during industrialization, were affecting women the most. So they felt that if they could get a right to vote, that they would be able to have a say in working conditions and be able to basically participate in those things that men had always been able to. the thought process was, okay, the industry or the factory down the road that, the meatpacking industry or the meatpacking factory down the road got all their rights good and dandy because all of them were men. But the textile industry or the textile factory that we work at has nothing because we can't stand up for ourselves. Okay? So this next generation, or basically after the turn of the century, we just get a new round of faces. We get a new round of women coming through and joining the movement for a variety of different reasons. So with the new generation also normally comes a new strategy, right? The suffrage movement had been going on for so long that the original founders of the original women in power were passing away. So something's got to be not working, right? Like if we've been going at this for so long and there's still no results, something has got to be like not working, right? So we've got a new round of people, and with the new round of people comes a new leader. Carrie Chapman Catt ends up becoming the leader of Nassau after Susan B. Anthony's death. And unfortunately, she was kind of on the same pathway as they always had been, that they should be playing the state-by-state strategy, that we can carefully move from state to state and gain support one by one. He also believed, or excuse me, she also believed that the women of the suffrage movement should continue to support President Woodrow Wilson, even though he specifically and outright didn't support the suffrage movement. Because, quote, Democrats were a safer bet than Republicans. It may seem like they're just kind of playing the political field and trying to do what's best, but a lot of suffragettes were very upset by this notion that they should continue to support Woodrow Wilson, even though they didn't support him, or he didn't support them. And another thing, or one other piece of the puzzle that's going to really separate the younger generation to the older generation of the suffrage movement is that Carrie Chapman Catt always held the standard that when you are protesting, when you are fighting the fight, when you are basically speaking on behalf of the suffrage movement, that you should continue to act ladylike as to not embarrass the movement. So we have multiple instances of basically the suffrage movement being kicked out of places or kicked out of protests, having things shut down, and then just basically having to bow their heads and go away because that was to not embarrass them. Okay? It was a very skewed view of basically how this was supposed to be running. Although they had done these things in the past, or although this is kind of how they've been operating in the past, the state-by-state strategy, trying to stay ladylike and stay poised, it's a new century and they needed a new strategy. And people are very upset with Carrie Chapman Catt on this strategy, or on this continuation of what was already happening. All right, so this dissatisfaction with how things are being ran, so this, conflict that happens when Carrie Chapman Catt says, hey, you need to continue to support Woodrow Wilson, and the rest of the group goes, I think not. And her just kind of like trying to stick with the old ways of doing things is going to cause a rift and going to cause a conflict between the group. And normally when this happens, and this is no exception, when this happens, we get a split and we get a new party called the National Women's Party. I promise we're almost done. We're gonna move through it, power our way through, and then I got a fun video at the end. All right, so the new strategy, or where this rift happens, where this split happens, is that the national, or Nassau, is going to be its own cooperation or its own group in regards or in cooperation with the National Women's Party. The National Women's Party was very much younger than Nassau, and Alice Paul was selected to be the leader, and she believed in a more aggressive strategy. So instead of doing a state-by-state strategy, she decided that going for specifically a constitutional amendment, going basically for the head of the snake, was the way to go. That the more aggressive they could be directly to Washington, that they should take it. Alice Paul had also seen a lot of footage and had read a lot of things and had connected with a lot of people involved in the British suffrage movement, which just so happened to be happening at about the same time, basically within 10 years of each other. And she saw that these British suffragettes were doing the exact opposite. They were acting unladylike. They were making themselves known by not acting like they had been. They were heckling politicians. They were picketing outside of government buildings. They were starting riots. They were fighting people. They were getting arrested. Yeah. They were like actually protesting instead of just sitting by and like hoping something would happen. Okay. So Alice Paul said to the National Women's Party, okay, they got the right to vote, we need to start acting like that. And of course, they also refused to support President Wilson if he wouldn't support the women's suffrage movement. They basically told their husbands, their brothers, their sibling, or their sons, et cetera, not to vote for Woodrow Wilson until he outright supported women's suffrage. That picture at the very beginning that we talked about on Friday, where it said Kaiser Wilson, sorry, my computer, where it said Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten? You were so keen on the Germans, but 20 million people on your own land. That's where it comes from. It's the National Women's Party. That there's no more time to be nice. Woodrow Wilson doesn't deserve niceness anymore. These people who are stopping, legitimately blocking and voting no on women's rights over and over and over again do not deserve kindness. Sorry, something on my computer is going off. Yeah, that they do not deserve kindness anymore, that they need to adopt these unladylike strategies if they want anything done. All right. So eventually we see that the National Women's Party in their new strategy, of going directly for a congressional amendment, being unladylike, and basically heckling politicians until they gave up, was seemingly working. Okay? They were gaining much more traction. They were gaining much more attention. If you think back to like when Susan B. Anthony got arrested, she got more attention than she ever would have if she wouldn't have gotten arrested. Okay. So the same kind of thing is applying here. These people of the National Women's Party are getting arrested. They are heckling all these politicians. They are stepping out of their comfort zone. And eventually, the Nassau, the version of these kind of older white women that are like, we probably shouldn't do that, end up joining the National Women's Party. And eventually, finally, you get the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. So those strategies that they had picked up, the change that they had made, had substantially helped them win the right to vote. And the 19th Amendment states that the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. It has almost the same written format as the 15th Amendment with the right to vote based on race, ethnicity, previous servitude, which sets a standard or is a very, it's put that way for a reason, that it should have been done a long time ago. So by 1920, we have the 19th Amendment following the 18th of Prohibition, that women get the right to vote, or I should say that vote shall not be denied on the account of sex. This is a major milestone, obviously, for a movement that had been happening since the early 1800s. And the first election, basically, after this happened, there were record-breaking election numbers, not just because of women joining the vote, but also because of a lot of men who had been refraining from voting because they were suffragettes, or in support of suffragettes, I should say, went back to the polls. Excuse me. Okay. So, woohoo, we've got the right to vote. Dab on them, okay? Things are looking good, things are looking up. We made a bad decision with the 18th Amendment, but with the 19th Amendment, we came back in swinging colors, okay? So we're starting off basically the 1920s on a high note, that we're starting off the 1920s with the women's right to vote, and it's gonna make a huge difference in the following pieces of legislation and following elections that are gonna happen during the 1920s. Things are actually gonna be skewed because of women's right to vote, okay? All right, you can go ahead and put your notes away, please and thank you. That's all we had for today in terms of notes. I have one last thing, excuse me, that I would like to do with you. It's basically just a video. I thought we'd end off the Monday on kind of a high note, maybe something fun, okay? The video I'm going to show you is a drunk history. Woohoo! We haven't had one of those in a hot second. Drunk history over the British suffragettes. So I had mentioned that the United States suffragettes, or the people who were participating in the US suffrage movement, had taken a lot of tips or had taken a lot of things from the British movement. So this drunk history is going to talk about what the British movement looked like and the type of things that they did to gain their right to vote. Okay. Do I want to record it? I don't think I want to record it. Goodbye recording.